Welcome to a Chumps Thoughts. In this video, I want to talk about something a little bit controversial and give my opinion on something I think they need to be changing. And what that is the usage and production of dinarrows. Now, dinarrows, and more importantly, their enchanted versions, are used at an incredibly high rate, and they are produced at an incredibly low rate. Now, this isn't as big of a deal for mainscapers because they're able to buy and purchase their enchanted arrows. Meanwhile, Ironmen obviously have to make them. Now, I'm not a person who's going to be complaining about the fact that we have to make arrows. That's not the issue. The real issue is the fact of how slow they are to make and how quickly they get used up. These are the best in slot arrows when you're ranging. However, they're used at such a huge rate that it makes them not viable and not useful to actually go ahead and use. This is because the production is so slow and the usage is so high that when you're using them, the kill times that you get, which are better, are not worth the time investment used to create this ammunition. Basically, Ironmen are stuck using the base dinarrows to make sure that we can continue to range, so we don't get the best value out of things like the Bow of the Last Guardian. Now, I will be the first to admit that I am kind of a little biased here because I did just get the bow, as you saw in the last episode of Chump to Champ. Shameless plug. However, I think there needs to be a change made. That being said, I'm not blind to the fact that, you know what, this is probably one of the best moneymakers for skillers, and I don't want to be taking that away. However, I think changes need to be made to this, and I want to talk about my own personal opinion on what should happen more towards the end of this video. Before we get into it, I want to talk about the production and what it takes to make these arrows. Now, the process of making enchanted dinarrows is done in 6 steps. First, we have zygomite care styling, which gives us the temporal fungal shaft. Next, we have segregation, which gives us the sharp shell shards. Then we have experimentation, which gives us the dinosaur propellant. After we get those 3 base ingredients, we then have combining the temporal shaft with the dinosaur propellant to make the headless dinarrow, and then we have tipping the headless dinarrow with the sharp shell shards. After we finish that, we then have enchanting the dinarrows. Now, I tested doing each of these for about 6 minutes, well, most of them for 6 minutes, to extrapolate how much you can make if you did each activity for 1 hour. First up, we have making the temporal fungal shafts from zygomite care styling. During this time, I did a 6-minute test where I was able to make 680 temporal fungal shafts. Up next, we have segregation, making the sharp shell shards. While making the sharp shell shards during the 6-minute test, I was able to make 790 total sharp shell shards, making use of bladed dive and surge to help boost my numbers. Up next, we have experimentation, which gives us the dinosaur propellant. During the time of doing the dinosaur propellant, I was able to do 2 full inventories in about the 6 minutes. It took slightly longer by a couple seconds to convert the manure into the dinosaur propellant, but I ended up with about 1,141 total dinosaur propellant. The next 2 activities I did not do for the full 6 minutes just because they happened so quickly that I didn't have enough supplies to last the full 6 minutes. Those 2 activities are making the headless dinarrows and tipping the headless dinarrows. When making the headless dinarrows, I was able to make about 750 headless dinarrows in 1 minute. Tipping them took the same amount of speed at 750 in a minute. This translates into making 4,500 headless dinarrows in 6 minutes, and then tipping those 4,500 in the next 6 minutes. The final step is enchanting the dinarrows, which I was able to complete 1,200 enchanted full arrows in the 6-minute time frame. Now, the numbers that we're seeing on screen are not going to always be 100% exact. That's because you get different numbers every time you collect some shafts, shards, and propellant, as well as different things can cause variances in getting these items. Things like missing your surges and bladed dives, things like missing ticks because the activities are just painstakingly boring, and things of that nature. Now, the nice part is these numbers are close enough to each other that we can kind of see how much time we're going to spend at each activity relative to one another. What I mean by that is because of the way these numbers line up and using estimates, let's say I'm spending 6 minutes creating shafts, I'd be spending about 6 minutes creating shards, I'd be spending about 3 minutes making the propellant, I would take about 1 minute to make the headless arrow, about another minute making the dinarrow, and about another 3 minutes to enchant those dinarrows. So basically, if you're spending 6 minutes collecting shafts, you're spending a total of 20 minutes making arrows. For the ease of argument and the sake of Accounting for variability, let's just say that in a 20-minute block, you can make 680 enchanted dinarrows, allocating time to each activity. That would translate to roughly 2,040 enchanted dinarrows within an hour. However, we didn't include the time it takes to gather the anima. Now, I'm just going to use full as an example here because full arrows are the ones that I would personally use the most of, and they seem to be the best arrow overall. Now, during my AFK wait for a Zuck time, I tend to get 6,000 anima in an hour, which is enough to make 2,000 arrows. So let's just be generous with the amount of anima we get and say it's a 1-to-1 ratio in time spent creating and enchanting dinarrows versus time collecting the anima. So we can split this number in half and say we make roughly 1,020 arrows an hour. Now we have to check how many arrows we actually end up using per an hour. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do about a minute of PVM on this dummy. And I'm going to see how many you start with, how many you end with, and then multiply the amount used by about 60. So it's basically going to be a swiftness rotation and one out of swiftness. Let's see how many arrows I use. I'm starting with 2,173 full arrows. So I hit the stopwatch at about 1 minute. I ended with 2,150 full arrows left in the quiver, meaning I used 23 arrows in a minute. If we do the math on that, 23 times 60, I end up using 1,380 arrows per minute camping the bow. Just like arrow creation, arrow usage is going to have some variance as well. Because we do swap ammo around using death spores from time to time, we might throw in some crossbows to use some hydric scrickos to gain a bunch of adrenaline and things like that. So just for the sake of argument, let's say we are using 1,020 arrows an hour. So it's a 1-to-1 ratio with creating the arrow versus using the arrows. Therein lies the problem. Because the time spent making the enchanted dinarrows versus the time spent using said enchanted dinarrows is roughly a 1-to-1, it's almost impossible for it to ever be worth using the enchanted dinarrows at all for an Ironman. Now, I'm not a person who would be willing to complain about something if I didn't think I had a possible solution for it. So the question becomes, how can we fix this issue for Ironmen and make it worth using the enchanted god arrows while not destroying something that's useful for mains and skillers as a fantastic moneymaker? My proposed solution to this issue is to make a new untradeable version of the god arrows that could have an increased output of the arrows by making an untradeable version of the 3 base ingredients, the shafts, the shards, and the propellant that collect at an increased rate, and to decrease the anima needed to charge the untradeable arrow. To find a proper number, we need to know how much it costs for these arrows to be used and make sure the value of making an untradeable version of these arrows is not time and cost efficient to make and use over just buying them from the Grand Exchange. To find this number, we need to know where these arrows are worth using, how much the arrows cost to be used, and a proper cost benefit of using the untradeable arrows over the tradable version. First, let's look at the cost of these arrows. As of recording, each arrow is valued in the GE within 100 GP of 4,000 each, except for Wen, which has a value of 3,700. Meaning, to use the tradable version viably, the gain needs to be more than 4 million GP per an hour at the location you're using it to make the tradable arrows viable. We also need to factor in the opportunity cost of making the untradeable arrow and using the untradeable arrow versus just making the propellant, which is the most valuable part of the process, earning roughly 25 million GP per an hour, according to the wiki. This is the bare minimum that someone with the stats to make these arrows can make. We need to factor in how much money can be made at a boss and how much time is spent making the untradeable arrow to see where these would be worth using over the tradable version. In order to not butcher the money making for skillers, the goal would be to make using the untradeable version not economically viable to use over simply just buying the arrows. With factoring all of this in, the number I came up with is 3 times the production for the untradeable version, meaning 3 times more shafts, shards, and propellant, and making the anima usage for charging the untradeable version a 1-to-1 or 1 anima per an arrow. This is because any boss a main would use an untradeable arrow for would need to be able to beat out the value of 25 million GP per an hour, the value of making just the propellant. In order for a boss to have value using the tradable arrows, it needs to have an increase of 4 million GP over the hour over not using the arrows, which means for a boss to have value in using the untradeable version, it needs to have an increase of 4 million coins over the 40-minute period, since we have to spend a third of your time spent making arrows, or an increase of 6 million coins an hour over not using the arrows. This is a very small amount of bosses that I can think of that fit this criteria, but we also have to factor in what people enjoy. In general, in my experience, skillers would rather skill for their money, PVMers would rather PVM. Unless the value of making the untradeable version was astronomically high, people would not do them for their own use. Through my research, the only boss that I can find that actually fits this criteria is the various enrages at Zamorak. But would the people camping Zamorak rather just spend more time camping Zamorak, or spend a third of their time making the arrows? So what do you think? Should Jagex make an untradeable version, or am I being a little biased? Let me know in the comments below. As always, have a wonderful day, be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.